right, everybody, as we're getting started, Bethany Falvey and Lauren Jones, you may see their names as part of the panel on the presentation today. They are both staff members here at the Kansas Historical Society with me, and they're going to be helping us answer questions and address any comments in the chat. Bethany, if you would, go ahead and try to put up that first poll question so we can make sure it works before we really get underway here. We'll give people a chance to start working on that.
It should be
you should up. See, okay, thank you. You should see on your screen one of a couple of poll questions that we're going to ask at the beginning here. We just want to get a sense of who all is joining the call today and where you are in the process of having a National Register property and get a sense of kind of who you are as an audience. So I'll give you a couple of seconds here to answer the poll question. Okay, it looks like most of you all have a property that's already listed in the National Register of Historic Places, which is good. Some of you have properties that are a contributor to a National Historic District, and about 12% or maybe a little bit more do not have a property listed already in the historic district or individually, which is okay. For this program, there actually is the opportunity to get your property listed on the register as part of the project, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it is important to get your property determined eligible for listing before you apply. So be sure and contact our office about that when you have some time after the presentation.
Did you want to do the second question?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do the second one, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So the second question is asking you as a property owner, what category do you fall in? Just so we can kind of get a sense of who all is in the audience today. By the way, all of these different categories are eligible for the grant funding, so that's not a problem. All right, so about evenly split between individual property owners and nonprofit organizations. That's great. And then I also see some local governments, historical societies, and then unincorporated and for-profit corporations. So that's good to know. As I noted, all of those categories are eligible for funding. We will try to address our comments and stuff to the majority of you all, but if you do have questions that relate specifically to your project or your situation, be sure and contact us later after the presentation for more one-on-one type feedback. All right, thank you, Bethany, for those poll questions. We are going to get started here. My name is Katrina Ringler. I am the Preservation Office Supervisor here at the Kansas Historical Society in the Preservation Office. I have administered the Federal Historic Preservation Fund grant program since 2008. And the grant we're going to talk about today, the Kansas Rural Preservation Grant, is actually a part of the Federal Historic Preservation Fund. So the Kansas Rural Preservation Program is going to provide grants to owners of historic properties in rural Kansas communities. The program is funded through a competitive subgrant program from the National Park Service. Kansas was among one of 8 recipients to receive funding from the Paul Brune Historic Revitalization Grant Program in 2020. We're going to try to pull up a couple, we pulled up a couple of those poll questions to just get a sense of the audience. And we know a little bit more about you now, so we are going to get started. Hopefully the slides will work. There we go. So the Historic Preservation Fund that I mentioned that this program is associated with was actually established in the 1970s. It's a source of preservation grants and financial assistance to states, tribes, and local governments, as well as nonprofits and other partners like universities. This grant program is administered by the National Park Service, so you'll hear me mention NPS or National Park Service quite often. The monies are awarded to state historic preservation offices, or SHPOs. We like our acronyms, sorry about that, to finance activities that are going to contribute to the planning for preservation of the built environment and archaeological resources. This money actually is not taxpayer money. It actually comes from offshore outer continental oil and mineral receipts. It is a fund that the National Park Service uses for a variety of different activities related to preservation. We are going to talk first of all about the eligible properties that can apply for this grant program. The applicant, of course, does need to be the legal property owner. It cannot be a state or federal government, unfortunately, but can be an individual, a local government. It could be a for-profit corporation. It just cannot be a state or federal agency. Properties, as I mentioned earlier, must be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as a contributing property to a National Register listed historic district, or they may be a property that is determined eligible for listing and will become listed in the National Register as part of this project. If your property is not yet listed on the National Register, you will need to get a determination of eligibility letter from us at the SHPO before you apply for your grant. That letter does need to be attached to the application. We do the determination letters based on a preliminary worksheet that we call a PSIQ. It's just a worksheet that you fill out with a little bit of information about your property and submit to us with photographs showing the inside and outside of a building or the layout of the property so that we can evaluate that against the National Register criteria. We recommend reaching out to the SHPO at least a month, 30 days or more ahead of the grant deadline because it does usually take us about 30 days to review a preliminary worksheet. And of course, if there's a lot of them coming in from the grantees this time of year, we may get a little bit backed up. Properties must also be in a community in Kansas with a population less than 30,000, according to the 2010 US Census. In the application and the application instructions, you'll find a link to the 2010 Census website where you can put in the name of your community and it will pull up the census population numbers. Part of the application is also a essay question, a narrative question asking you to verify or justify why you think your community is rural in character. So for example, there may be communities in suburban locations outside of Kansas City or Wichita or some of the other bigger communities in our state that are technically under 30,000 in population, but wouldn't necessarily be characterized as rural by most folks. So if you think that your property is in a community that would qualify, just make sure you kind of keep in mind that you do have to explain to the grant committee why you think that your community should be defined as rural, especially if it's in a suburb of a larger community. Bethany and Lauren, feel free to stop me if there's any questions that I need to address.
I added a link to the program information where those links can be found.
Perfect, thank you so much. So when you're looking at your grant application and thinking about the project that you want to apply for, you'll need to think about the types of activities that this grant will allow. So what's eligible for the grant? We can fund rehabilitation projects, which are generally when a building is being continually used or upgraded for new uses. Rehabilitation projects might include things like upgrading mechanical systems or remodeling bathrooms and kitchens. It could also involve just general repairs. We can fund restoration projects where there might be a missing feature that needs to be restored based on documentation like a photograph. We can also fund preservation projects where you're simply repairing or replacing to match something that is deteriorated and needs to be fixed. Now, out of the three of those, preservation type projects are generally going to be the ones that are most likely to be funded, because if you think about how competitive this program might be, it's pretty intense. And of course, if someone is applying for a grant to repair their roof, they're probably going to get considered for funding over someone who's just needing their bathroom remodeled. Other services that we can fund with this grant include consultant services. So the grant will reimburse for the cost of architect or engineering fees, but the cost of those services cannot be more than 20% of the project total. So if you do need a consultant to be hired for your project, keep that in mind. You're welcome to hire those services outside of the grant and fund that with other funding sources. But if they are funded by the grant, then you cannot exceed 20% of the project total. And also the consultant must be hired with the same competitive process requirements as we will talk about in a little bit when hiring a contractor. It is critical to note that because this is federal funding, grantees are going to be required to enter into a preservation easement or covenant after the project is done. And that easement is going to require areas or items that were funded by the grant to be visible to the public at least 12 days per year. So we are not going to fund any projects that cannot meet that requirement. In general, that means projects owned by private individuals should only include work that's visible from the exterior and the public right-of-way. We don't want to require anybody to open their home or private property to the public, just to meet that requirement. Keep in mind too that the grant is meant to be a positive impact on rural communities. So it's important to explain to the grant committee how your project is going to meet that requirement. And it will be hard for you to explain that if the project can't be seen by the public or used by the community. All project work, of course, has to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and historic preservation. And that's primarily our job at the SHPO. Bethany and I and others on the staff will review your project scope of work to make sure it will meet those standards and work with you if we feel like it needs to be changed. Grants will be awarded, as it says on the slide, between $5,000 at the bottom end and $50,000 at the top end. We do have only $500,000 to give out. We expect to give it all out. So if we gave $50,000 grants to 10 grantees, that may be all that we have to give out. So we're expecting between 8 and 12 grantees this grant round.
Katrina?
Yes.
I have a question. Does the 20% for consultant services, does that mean the grant total or 20% of the total project costs?
That's a good question. I'm going to say the total project costs, but I may have to verify that. I believe that's what I read. It was 20% of the project cost, but I could be wrong. If you keep it within 20% of the grant reimbursement, that would keep you safe. And we can verify that with our National Park Service contacts.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk a little bit about reimbursement. You may have noticed earlier I said reimbursement when I was talking about funding eligible activities. This is a reimbursement program. It is not the kind of grant where you will get a check up front to use toward your project cost. It is expected that you will have to pay contractors and craftsmen and consultants as the bills come due, and then we will reimburse you 90% of eligible costs up to the grant amount. Grantees are expected to have to maintain the cash flow of the project as they go. So it's important to have your match at least the 10% in hand at the time that the applications are due, and preferably more than that, just to be able to say to the grant committee that you're able to keep the project rolling as you wait on reimbursements. For each reimbursement, we will withhold a 10% retainage. That is our policy internally to make sure that we see a satisfactory completion of the project. At the end of the work, we will reimburse the final 10%. We always recommend to grantees that you have a similar policy when you're working with your contractors, withholding from them 5 to 10% of their pay to make sure that they complete the project to your expectations. All projects must be completed for the reimbursements to be paid out. We cannot reimburse for partially done work. So for example, if you're doing a roof project, the contractor may want payment at the point where he has removed all of the old shingles and laid down the underlayment. We cannot reimburse you for those costs until the actual shingles and finish work on the roof is done. All of the project costs need to be completed and the reimbursement needs to be paid out by the end of the grant period, which by the requirements of this particular funding source are going to be no later than the summer of 2023. I think we have in the grant application materials, July 2023 as the cutoff. Because the program is a reimbursement, we cannot accept any kind of other match. In-kind services, donated materials, donated services cannot serve as match. It has to be a cash match because really what it is you're paying the contractor as the bills come due and then getting reimbursed. So you can't donate something to the project and end up getting the grant money as a return. Some other general conditions, some of them I've mentioned, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here. So I mentioned earlier that competitive bidding for consultants and contractors is required. There is specific items, and we do have a checklist available from the SHPO, but there are certain items and a process that you do need to go through when you are hiring a consultant or a contractor, where you expect those services to be reimbursed by the grant. It does have to be competitive, it does have to be public, but it does not mean that you have to select the lowest bidder. And we always want you to select someone that you know is going to give you the best quality work for the price that's in your budget. So you don't have to select the lowest bidder, but you do need to select someone who is qualified and has experience. We do have a list of some contractors and consultants here at the SHPO that we're willing to share as a guide or a starting place. It's by no means comprehensive though, so definitely check with local contractors and seek out some other qualified bidders potentially too. As I mentioned earlier, the cash match does need to be in hand and documented no later than the grant deadline, which is March 1st. The grant application does ask you to upload proof of that cash match. That could be something like a bank statement or a letter from a bank guaranteeing a loan. It could be documentation of donations that you've received, anything that shows us that you are ready to go for when the project is awarded. If you think about it from the grant committee standpoint, they are looking for projects that are going to be ready to go as soon as the grant agreement is signed. They don't want to fund projects that end up having to wait for, maybe a fundraising campaign or something like that. That's potentially a problematic project that may not get finished in time. Grant projects that will have a preservation easement, like I mentioned earlier, those preservation easements do have to be attached to the deed to the property. Let me talk a little bit more about that. So all federal funding where it's a development project, physical work is happening on a building, requires some kind of easement or covenant attached to the property at the end of the project. The words easement and covenant are used interchangeably in this program, so you may hear either one used. So once the project is completed, we will write up a description of the property, its character defining features. There will be photographs attached to that document documenting its condition at the time the easement is signed. Both the SHPO and the property owner will sign that easement, and then it needs to be filed with the Register of Deeds in your county. And it will be on the deed for the property, and it will follow the property for the given easement time period. So the easement just allows the SHPO a say in how the property is maintained and altered during the easement period. And as you can see, easement periods are based on the size of the grant award. So a $50,000 grant under this program would require a minimum of a 10-year easement, whereas smaller grants require lesser time periods, maybe 5 years or even less. So a sample easement agreement is available from our office if you'd like to see what one looks like and what the requirements in it say. I definitely recommend anybody that has any questions about those, reach out to us and we can provide that. So before we start talking about the application itself, I want to talk a little bit about how the application is going to be evaluated. In the grant materials, the instruction pages, the program information, you will find this little chart that lays out how many points each part of the grant application is worth. You'll notice that the sections also are included in the application. They match the evaluation criteria. So the grant committee is going to look at these areas as they make their determinations. Basically, the need and urgency of the project. How critical is it to get this project done? The impact to the community and also the justification on why this is a rural location that needs the support. With the grant committee is going to be looking at the impact of the project. So how is it going to be measured and how successful will this project be? And the organizational and professional ability of the grantee. So how much experience do you have administering grants in the past? And do you have the personnel and team together to make this a successful project? Then they're also going to look at your budget and your scope of work. And then they also have the ability to give 5 extra points just for the overall application, sort of the feeling and their perception and their evaluation of the application overall. In the end, the grant committee really needs to feel confident that the project is going to be feasible, that the applicant's organization has the personnel and financial means to implement the project, and that the project's likely to have a positive long-term impact on preservation, either at the state level or local level. The committee is going to evaluate the budget to be certain it's reasonable and sufficient for the work proposed. And you're encouraged to be very clear in your answers to ensure that the committee will fully understand the project. Each section of the application is very important. So don't let any section go unanswered, or don't just blow off one section because you think, oh, that's probably not going to be important. They're all important, and they're all going to contribute to the overall score that your application gets. So the evaluation criteria on the previous slide are giving actual points. We anticipate that this is going to be a pretty competitive grant round. And so we anticipate that maybe there will be some ties, or there will be some close projects that maybe it's going to be hard for the grant committee to make a decision. So some other things that they will be taking into consideration are whether or not the property is in a certified local government, a CLG, whether they're in a Main Street community, whether the property is currently already listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and if the project meets one of the goals of the 2019 Rural Prosperity Listening Tour report, which was done under the auspice of the Lieutenant Governor's Office and the the Office for Rural Prosperity. The goals are linked and I believe maybe outlined in the program information. So if you aren't sure what those goals are, definitely look them up or contact us and we can direct you. So you'll notice that we are using an online grant submission system this year called Submittable. It is a third-party vendor that we have contracted with, and we have successfully used it for a couple of grant applications so far. And so when you click on the link on our website, it will take you into this Submittable kind of system where you'll need to create a login if you don't have one already. We are not offering this year a preliminary application review just because of staffing availability and the amount of applications we expect to get. But staff will do our best to answer questions from applicants and address any technical issues. So please feel free to reach out to us. As you see on the screen, just read through the program information very carefully before you start the application online. They will be accepted through March 1st, 2021 at 11:59 p.m. So right before midnight is when the application will be open, and then it will cut off and no longer allow submissions. You do have to create that submittable login to be able to apply. And you can save a draft and continue work later. We just aren't necessarily going to look at those drafts and offer any feedback for this grant round. So when you actually get into the application, you'll notice that the first thing you'll see is an eligibility check. These are 2 questions that are asked to all applicants just to make sure that you are eligible to apply for the grant. The first question is just simply asking you to make sure that your community is under the $30,000 threshold required by the program. If you select the category where it says more than 30,000, the system will notify you that you're not eligible to apply. There is a link on that application section to take you to the 2010 census if you haven't looked already. So you can verify that your community is under that $30,000 or 30,000 population mark. The second question is just asking you to select whether your property is a National Historic Landmark listed in the National Register individually, listed as a contributor to a district, or is not listed in the National Register. If you select not listed in the National Register, it will allow you to go ahead and proceed with the application, but it will also remind you that you need that determination of eligibility letter from the SHPO before you proceed. To clarify, just because sometimes it's confusing, National Historic Landmark is different than National Register of Historic Places. There are only about 25 or 26 National Historic Landmarks in the state of Kansas. And they are kind of few and far between. So if you are not sure if your property is listed as a National Historic Landmark or just listed on the National Register, please be sure and look at our website or give us a call or an email, and SHPO staff can verify that for you. Into the application proper, you will be seeing sections of the application just listed alphabetically. We start off, of course, with general information asking about the legal property owner, since that has to be the applicant for this program. One of the bits of information we do ask for because of the federal funding component is a DUNS number. The Dun & Bradstreet number is a unique 9-digit identifier that's strictly for businesses and governments. So applicant entities who are not private individuals do have to provide a DUNS number for us because we will have to have that for the federal funding. If your organization does not have a DUNS number right now, please just put pending and make sure that you go out and apply for a DUNS number. That will be required before we sign a grant agreement with you. Again, if you're an individual, you do not have to have this. You can just put NA and go on to the next category. Section B is asking for a little bit of information about the historic property itself, where it's located. And it does ask you again to tell us what's the population of the community where the property is located. Section C, the grant administrator, is important because it is the information we need about the point of contact for the grant. The property owner may or may not be the person who is going to be the point of contact for the project. Information, critical notifications and things are going to be sent to both property owner and grant administrator. But sometimes the grant administrator does not know that they are the grant administrator, and that can be a problem. So make sure if you are putting someone other than the property owner as the grant administrator, they know that they are the grant administrator and they have given their contact information to you for this application purpose. This should be the person that we will be contacting once the grant is awarded or not. Section D is asking for the applicant's status. So just like you did with the poll question at the beginning of the webinar, we're going to ask you to pick the one that best fits your circumstance. Are you a private individual, a nonprofit, a local government? And then Section E is the historic property listing status. Again, are you listed in the National Register, in a historic district, or if you're not listed in the National Register yet, this is the place where you will be able to upload that determination letter from the SHPO to show us that the property has been determined eligible for listing. Section F is asking some additional property information. You need to indicate here if your property is in a community noted as a certified local government or a Main Street community. As I mentioned before, those are details that could be critical to breaking a tie, or the grant committee could take those into consideration if they're having a hard time making a decision. Section G, finally, in this very beginning part of the application, is just asking you to provide a very brief summary overview of the proposed work. So if this is a roof replacement project or a window repair project or a masonry repair project, just very briefly give us an overview of what the plan is. There is also a box under that Section G asking you if you intend to apply for and utilize the historic tax credit program. This is important because we want to make sure that we don't, first of all, that you don't miss out on additional funding resources that may be available to you. And also we know that we should be asking you about a historic tax credit application later in the process. Bethany, Lauren, are there any questions right now that we need to address?
We've been answering them as we go, so none right now.
Okay. So once you get through that beginning part of the application, you're going to get into the application sections that ask for a short essay or narrative answer. You will note at the bottom, if you can see at the bottom of the box where you answer, there is a character limit. Once you hit that character limit, it will not let you type anymore. So you do have to keep your answers pretty concise to be able to make sure you're getting your information in there under that character limit. Section H is asking you to describe the condition of the property and how it got into this condition. It wants you to prioritize the preservation work that's needed and describe what is the most urgent need right now. And then explain to us why the funding is critical right now. Urgency is one of the biggest things that the grant committee looks at. As I mentioned earlier, someone with a hole in the roof is probably going to get funded over someone else who has a property that's in good condition, but just needs a bathroom remodel. So if your project is urgent, if you have water coming in, snow is blowing in the windows, the foundation is moving, those are all urgent needs that you want to make sure you bring up in this section. Other things that may be critical would be that there is some other kind of project happening soon, and this project needs to happen before like a road construction project happens, or before, it could even be before the anniversary of a project is coming up, just to accentuate the fact that the project needs to happen as quickly as possible. Section I gets into that community impact and rural justification. As I mentioned earlier, one of the evaluation pieces that the grant committee can take into account is whether or not your project fits into that 2019 Rural Prosperity Report goals. And the goals are listed there at the left. You can also find a link in the program information to the full report. But this section is asking you to explain how the project fits into the community, and how it fits into those goals and objectives of the report. The goal of the program, of course, is to support work on historic properties in Kansas that are going to protect and foster economic development. This section is where you're going to justify the project's impact in the community and its context within rural Kansas communities.
Katrina?
Yes.
We've had several questions about how to justify their rural property, especially ones that are within maybe more metro counties. Mm-hmm. And also sometimes the U.S. Census Tract website will not show your or it won't show the community because it's too small.
Right.
So
let me address the second one first, because that one's the easiest one. Yeah, obviously, if your community is smaller and is not listed on the census tract, that's fine. That means you're well under the 30,000 population threshold. So if you're in an unincorporated area or something like that, just do your best to fill in the blank where it asks about population. You could even put the population of the county if that's helpful. So I think that is the easy one. The justification of your rural character of your community is going to be a little bit harder. We have not done this program before, so we are kind of depending on you all to make the justifications. If you feel like your project is in a suburb of, let's say, Wichita or Kansas City, technically it's in a community of less than 30,000, and you feel like it's a rural location. Maybe it's very open. There's no commercial development around it for so many miles. Maybe there are other kind of characteristics of a rural community that you feel are visible where you are, where your property is. That's, I think, what we're looking for, but we don't have a checkbox that we can tick off to say, well, if you have these 5 things, or if you don't have these 5 things, then you are, you're in a rural community. Defining what is rural is very difficult. As Bethany and I came to know as we were trying to put together the grant application, it's all about convincing the grant committee. So if the grant committee accepts your explanation and an argument that your community or your property is in a rural location, that's what they're looking for. So it's all about making the case. Section J is about measuring the success of your project. The grant committee is going to be looking for how will this project both preserve the historic property and can contribute to the rural community. How is the project going to impact the social and economic viability of the community? And how are you going to measure the success of your project? So, let's say the roof is going to get repaired or the windows are going to be restored. That could be a physical measure of the success. It could just be something you can look at and see, but you also might want to talk about how the community is now going to use the building. Is it going to be open to the public? Is it going to be used for community activities? Is it going to be a source of pride as a landmark in the community now that it's restored or repaired? The answers to this section, again, are as different as the properties that are going to be applying. It could be completely different for every single property. You just want to make your case and explain how your project is going to be deemed a success in the end. And then section K and section L. K is all about the team or the personnel who are going to be working on the project. So who is going to be the grant administrator? That should be your point of contact, the person that was listed back on the first part of the application. And we want to know a little bit about what are their qualifications. So what's their involvement with the project? Do they have a background in grant administration? Maybe they have a background in accounting or procurement procedures. They are really astute at record keeping. And have they had previous experience with grant administration? So if they've worked on other state or federal grants, be sure to explain that there and tell us a little bit about that past experience. The grant committee is going to be looking at that to also, see how they think this grant will work out. One of the things that the grant committee and the staff are going to be tasked with doing is a risk assessment. And so we are going to be looking at each application and providing to the grant committee and the National Park Service a justification on whether or not we think any of these grant applications may be risky. So giving grant money to a grant applicant who does not have experience doing grants in the past, or who does not have someone helping them that has experience, could be deemed as a risky grant to give. Section L is related to the budget requirements. The program, as I noted earlier, is going to reimburse 90% of project costs up to the grant award amount upon completion of those approved work items. Grantees do have to have that money in hand to pay the bills as they come due. So at minimum, we need to see that the applicant has the 10% match in hand. We also encourage you to demonstrate that you have at least a little bit more than that to be able to cash flow the project. But we do need to see documentation uploaded in that section showing us that you have the cash in hand to get the project started. We do expect that there will be a lot of competition for this grant funding. And so the grant committee is going to be looking for projects, like I said earlier, where there's an experienced team administering the grant and that the applicant has the resources in hand to get started quickly. Section M is a little bit more involved than the sections above it. The grant committee is going to be basically looking for what you're doing with the grant money, and we need specific work items described. They want to know how much the work will cost. So line item by line item, what is the budget? And then they're going to be looking for when the work will be done. So an estimate of the project schedule. Writing out a detailed outline of the work you propose in the grant is what is critical in this section. You need to provide corresponding costs and estimated dates of completion for each task, and break up the work items into manageable headings, keeping in mind that we have to reimburse for completed work items. So if you have, let's say you have 12 windows that you are rehabilitating, you might want to break those up into, three sections of 4 windows each. Or you may want to say the north side windows, the east side windows, the south side windows, to break those up a little bit so that we can reimburse for those when they're completed. As I noted earlier, projects have to be completed by the summer of 2023 because that's when the federal funding ends. Should your project be funded, the information in this section is going to be used to develop a grant agreement. So it's critical that we have a good at least estimated budget and estimated schedule. It can be flexible later as your bids and competitive hiring comes in, but we have to at least have a good sense of where you're going with the project and how long it'll take. It is possible and recommended in this section that you might want to include a budget line item for unknown contingencies, just in case something unexpected comes up. It is usual to include about 20% of construction costs as a contingency line item, and you're welcome to do that. You are expected and are free to attach additional pages to this section. Even though there is a short box answer section here, there is also a place where you can add additional pages to help illustrate the scope, the budget, and the schedule. For example, you might have an estimate from your contractor you want to include that spells out everything, or you may have an outline in an Excel spreadsheet that you want to include. Just be sure to summarize the plan in the answer box and then attach the additional information. At the end of this section, you're going to finish up by inputting the total project cost. That would be the construction cost, the contingency, any consultant fees that you're going to include in the grant budget. So you get the total project costs, and then you're going to enter the grant amount requested, keeping in mind that the grant maximum is $50,000 and the grant request is always going to be 90% of the total project cost up to $50,000. At the bottom of that section, you'll finish up with an estimated project completion date, and then attach, as I said, any additional pages you need. Bethany, Lauren, are there any questions about that right now?
No.
The last part of the application is asking you to attach several documents that we need. Section N has various places where it asks you to upload information. The first one is evidence of ownership by the property owner. There's a description within the application of the acceptable types of documentation that can be uploaded. These current title or deeds in the applicant's name are acceptable. Evidence of a current title insurance policy or other documentation from a local government attesting to the current ownership of the property is preferred. We need something that has your name as the property owner on it, and a legal property description needs to be on the document. We're also asking you to upload evidence of your match. So types of acceptable documentation could include a bank statement, a loan guarantee letter, evidence of a donation, confirmation of funding from another source, like another grant or a loan. As I mentioned earlier, we just need to see that you have the money in hand to be able to get started on the project. We're also going to ask you to upload photographic documentation of the property. And the photos should include at least one image that shows a clear overall view of the front facade of the property or building. The remaining images are at the applicant's discretion, but you are responsible for the clarity of the images. And I will say that from some other grant applications we've seen recently, size of the images can be important. There is a size limit on the uploads, but it's not small. It's pretty big. So make sure when you're taking photographs with a digital camera or your digital phone, that you're taking them at a very high resolution so that when we open them up on the screen, they open up very large and can be zoomed in on. Otherwise, the grant committee may not be able to see the details that you're asking them to look at. Photos must be submitted in a complimentary way with the written application and clearly labeled. And we're going to talk a little bit more about photographs on the following slides. So I'll give you a little bit more tips and tricks about photographs. And then finally, for the attachments, we need letters of support. We ask you to provide up to 5 letters of support. Please make sure that they are signed by the person who is supporting the project, and do not have the supporters send letters to us directly. They have to be sent to you so that you can upload them with the application. If they're sent to us directly, they'll just go in a file and the grant committee will not see them. So as I mentioned about photos, the grant application does not allow you to submit more than 20 files uploaded. So they could be 20 images, either like JPEG or TIFF or PNG files. They could also be a PDF or a Word doc that has more than 1 image per page. I'll give you some examples of different ways that people have done grant photos in the past with other grant applications. It's really up to you to be creative and make sure that you're illustrating your project to the best of your ability. Make sure that the file name or the document itself is clearly labeled, which project this is, what building it is, when the photo was taken, what view we're looking at. Is this the east facade? Is this the interior, west bedroom? What are we looking at? And if it's very helpful sometimes to number the images to make sure that they're presented to the grant committee in the order that you prefer. So that way they know what order you want them to be viewed in. Just always be aware of the quality of your photos. If they're blurry or, like I said, small, they're not going to make the best impression on the grant committee. I will note that applicants that do get an award of this grant are going to be asked to provide a set of photos further detailing the project's before condition in a JPEG format for SHPO staff review and Park Service review. So even if you submit your photos on the application in a Word doc or a PDF, we're still going to ask you to submit them as a JPEG later if you get funded for the grant. These are just a couple of examples from another grant application, another grant program we have. The kind of photo that you might have as the first sort of what we call pretty picture of your project. We usually ask folks to take a photo from the corner of the front of the building to show the front and one of the side elevations and a little bit of the environment. So that way the grant committee can kind of see what the building looks like, where it is located, what kind of environment it's in, and then proceed on from that with other photographs showing the damage, the deterioration, the problems. That way they get a sense of that. If you're not applying for a building, which some of you may not have buildings, you may have cemeteries, historic sites, archaeological sites, use your best judgment about what would be a good overall illustrative photo to use to explain to the grant committee what you're trying to convey. SHPO staff, we can always try to give you our feedback on what we think might be a good image to use. To complete your application, just be sure you're including the photos that document the description that you have in section M. You don't want to explain to the grant committee how the windows are in really bad shape and you desperately need grant money to repair the windows, but then not show photographs of the windows. That is not going to convey the urgency or the need for the project or for the funding to the grant committee. Photos that show the areas of deterioration where work is needed are required as part of the application. You can always get very creative by using like rulers, pencils, straight edges, any kind of prop to illustrate the need. For example, if you have, showing a bucket of water under a roof leak is going to demonstrate to the grant committee that yes, the roof is leaking. A carpenter's level showing that the floor is uneven might be a good way to illustrate how uneven the floor really is. But you want to call out the problems in notes and maybe even draw lines to show exactly what it is you're pointing at in the photo. Because you can't always expect that the grant committee is going to know what you're trying to show them. Even if you submit a small diagram of the building showing where the photos were taken from, that can be very helpful to the committee as well. For some projects that have, roof issues or issues on the building that are high above the ground, contracting with a drone service or getting a lift might make the difference of a photo that really shows the problem or a photo that doesn't. And keep in mind that the grant reviewers are going to be looking at 40 to maybe 60 or more applications. Piling multiple images into one page can be helpful, but it also could be more confusing than providing clarity. So the grant reviewers that are going to be using the photographs to familiarize themselves with the project need to be able to see what it is you're trying to illustrate. And it could be difficult if you try to put too many things on one page. Be careful to show details with perspective. If you're showing, for example, a crack in a white plaster wall and you get too close, that doesn't convey any kind of information that the grant committee necessarily will understand. So you want to maybe back up a little bit and show some context as well. So the last thing on the grant application that you want to make sure of is the assurances page. The assurances document is linked on our webpage. It is a document that you need to download, read, print and sign, and then scan and upload back to the application. There are 3 pages to the assurances, and 2 of those pages require signatures by the property owner. And so if you have any questions about those assurances, be sure and contact SHPO staff. But these are the things that you're agreeing to if you're awarded the grant. So make sure that you understand them and agree to them before you submit the grant application. Last bit of advice is to make sure that you have reread your application before you hit submit. Maybe have someone else read it who is not familiar with the project. If you can convince them that you need funding, or you can explain to them if they have a good understanding of the project after reading your application, then you've probably written a good application. Every building tells a story, so make sure you're telling your story as you are competing with so many other people who also have compelling projects. The grant reviewers just wanted to see why they should fund yours over everyone else's. We are always able and happy to provide technical assistance, whether your property gets a grant or not. If you don't get a grant, keep in mind that we have another grant program, the Heritage Trust Fund, that has a grant round application due November 1st each year. We also have tax credit, tax incentive applications that we can talk to you about at any time. Those are not competitive and they don't have an application deadline. So good luck with your project. Here are reminders of the dates that you need to keep in mind. March 1st, applications are due by midnight on that night. And then May 8th is when the announcements of the grant awards will be held at the Historic Sites Board of Review meeting. It's a public meeting. Someday we might meet in person again. I don't know, we'll see. If not, it will be done via Zoom. And in the meantime, if you have any questions, please reach out to Bethany or I by email, or phone numbers are there. And we are going to wish you lots of luck and happy application writing. Bethany, Lauren, are there any other questions we didn't get to or anything else we need to address?
There are some people with hands raised.
Okay.
I'm gonna allow you to talk, Deanna Pearson.
Let's see, I'm going to ask you to unmute, Deanna. If you can unmute, you can ask your question. I don't know if she has a microphone.
Okay. We also had a question about, can federal funds be used as match, like a CDBG grant?
So for Historic Preservation Fund, which this is part of the Historic Preservation Fund at the federal level, CDBG funding is the only federal match that you can use with this federal funding. So if you have any kind of other federal funding, the answer is no, but CDBG specifically, the answer is yes.
Also, another question about federal regulations. Do projects need to be registered with the SAM program to receive the funding?
No,
award
because
management?
this is actually a sub-grant program. We are the grantee. We are registered with SAM. And so we will be drawing down the money from the federal agency and passing it on to the sub-grantees. So no, you as the sub-grantees don't have to register with SAM, as far as I know, unless I've misunderstood something, but that's been the process that we've used for other HPF funding.
We also have a question about if work's already begun before the project's been awarded, or what if work's
that's
already
a good
begun?
question. This grant could only reimburse for for work items that have not yet started. So if you maybe have a project that has several phases and you have started phases 1 or 2, but phase 3 is what you're really going to want this grant to fund. As long as phase 3 hasn't started and won't start until the grant agreement is signed between us and you, then that's fine. We just can't reimburse for work that's already started before the grant agreement is signed. And that has to do with other requirements. Like we have to see that you've competitively went out to bid for the contractor. We also have to verify that we've reviewed your scope of work and got that approved, not just by us, but by the National Park Service.
There's a question about the application, if there's a formal application on our website or if it's just the online version.
So we have moved away from any kind of paper or PDF application. The application has to be submitted through the online submittable system. So you have to go on, log into the submittable system, fill out the application. You can save a draft, but then once you're ready to submit it, you hit submit and it comes to us digitally.
And I've got someone with their hand raised. I'm gonna unmute Robert Elder. You should be able to talk.
Yes, I have a question about the economic impact. Well, in our case, it's a private farm. The economic impact for our project is going to be essentially supporting a farm operation as opposed to an operation that's going to be open to the public, such as a storefront or a business district. Do you think that the grant review committee would be open to the idea of a project that supports your own business operation as opposed to something that's going to be serving the public like a store?
I mean, I think they'll be open to it. It just depends on how it's going to compete with other folks that also submit an application. I do admit that I think it will be difficult to make the argument, but not impossible. I can foresee a way that you might be able to explain how the continued operation of your farm is an economic, driver of the economy of the county or the local community. Because if you weren't farming, then what else might the property be used for that may or may not contribute to the economy. So I think it's all about making the case, but I wouldn't give up on the grant just for that reason. I think you could probably make the case. Whether or not it competes well against other applications, we'll have to see.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I've got another hand raised. Kelly, I'm gonna unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Kelly.
Hi. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask anyway. Could a nonprofit organization apply on behalf of several different properties for a common purpose? So let's say, we've got a lot of limestone and so therefore masonry issues. So in order to maybe catch some small projects where there's nothing like a major masonry project, but to kind of help with some of these smaller projects where we go out and get a mason who can do maybe $5,000 worth of work for several different properties to kind of fix an ongoing foundation issue or water issue or roof issue or something like that, all related to that. Is that possible, or does it need to be kind of one application, one property?
I think for this particular grant program, we have to restrict it to just one property because it has to be the property owner that's the applicant, and we have that easement requirement on the back end. I'm going to direct you to the regular Historic Preservation Fund, which will also have applications due in March. Those are a yearly grant round, and traditionally we tend to fund surveys, National Register nominations, educational programming out of that fund, but we could fund what you're talking about through that program. And it wouldn't necessarily be as competitive as this one for that.
Okay, thanks. I had a feeling that would be a stretch, but I guess I didn't think about it from the Historic Preservation Fund perspective. So
yeah, it was worth a shot.
Yeah, thanks. I got to try.
Right.
Katrina, I've got another person with their hand raised.
Okay.
Scott, I'm going to allow you to talk.
We've recently purchased 3 buildings on Main Street in Wilson, Kansas, and my hope is to be able to use those buildings to create economic activity in town. So, fix them up and hopefully get some businesses in there. But the facades are all shot and they're going to need interior work and roofing work. But that would be something that would fall under this program. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think the difference between your project, what you were talking about, and what Kelly was talking about earlier, is that you own all 3 properties. Right. And so you as the property owner can be the applicant, and you can also agree to the easement, the property easement that has to go on the back end. So that would work. Okay,
so then would we be required to, like, if we get these fixed up and somebody wants to, say, buy one of the buildings to put their business in, would we be required to wait that 5 or 10 years, or can we sell it to them and then they have to comply with the?
Yeah, you can sell it to them, but the covenant or easement is still going to be on the property, and they'll just have to comply with that for the rest of the easement period. So if you sold it at year 2, then they would have 8 more years to comply. And it's not, I don't want to scare people with the easement. It's basically just, if they want to do something to the property, they need to make sure that we have reviewed it and okayed it. And it's major things, not everyday kind of maintenance work, but like an addition, or if they wanted to tear it down, or if they wanted to do a major renovation of the interior or something. It's just a check with us kind of requirement.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So it doesn't look like we have any more questions.